David Harrison returned from the dead to discover his mother-in-law had sold his house, buried his memory, and destroyed his marriage. What he didn't know was that Sarah, his wife, had spent 3 months locked in a psychiatric facility, shattered by grief he was about to turn into trauma. David's boots touched solid ground for the first time in 8 months, the familiar weight of his duffel bag settling against his shoulder as the Coast Guard transport helicopter lifted away from the makeshift landing zone. The rhythmic thud of rotor blades faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle crash of waves against the rocky Maine coastline he had dreamed about during those endless nights adrift in the life raft. He had been declared missing, presumed dead, after his cutter went down in a November storm off the Grand Banks. For 243 days, he had survived on a barren island with 3 other crew members, rationing emergency supplies and building makeshift shelters from wreckage. What he didn't know was that back home, his survival had become someone else's business opportunity. The taxi ride through Millbrook felt surreal. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, yet achingly familiar. The white clapboard houses with their green shutters, the lobster boats bobbing in the harbor, the weathered dock where he had proposed to Sarah 5 years ago. His heart hammered against his ribs as they turned onto Maple Street, anticipation building like pressure in a diving bell. The yellow sold sign stabbed into his front lawn like a gravestone marking his own burial. But this wasn't just about a house. As David stared at the lockbox where his key should have been, a more terrifying question began forming. If Margaret had sold his home without knowing he was alive, what else had she decided on Sarah's behalf? "You sure this is the right address, buddy?" the driver asked, following David's gaze to the sold sign. David nodded slowly, fishing crumpled bills from his pocket. His hand shook as he paid the fare. The taxi pulled away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk with his duffel bag, staring at his former home like a stranger. Behind the dark windows of 247 Maple Street, 8 months of decisions had been made without him. The windows were dark. No car in the driveway. The small garden Sarah had tended was overgrown with weeds, and paint was peeling from the front steps. A lockbox hung from the door handle where his key should have fit. But something else caught his attention: fresh tire tracks in the mud beside the house, as if someone had been watching, waiting. He walked around to the back, muscle memory guiding him to the spare key hidden under the loose board on the deck. His fingers found only empty space. The board had been nailed down tight. Someone had been thorough about erasing his access to his own life. "Can I help you?" David spun around. An elderly woman in a pink cardigan stood at the property line, her arms crossed, watching him with suspicious eyes. But her expression held something else, recognition mixed with fear, as if she was seeing a ghost she'd hoped would stay buried. "I live here," David said, then caught himself. "I used to live here. I'm David Harrison. This is my house." The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to shock, then to something that looked almost like guilt. "David Harrison? But you're dead. We went to your funeral." "I'm very much alive." His voice came out rougher than intended, months of rationed water having left his throat perpetually raw. "Where is my wife? Where is Sarah?" The neighbor took a step back, her hands trembling as she reached into her cardigan pocket. "She moved out months ago. After the funeral. Your mother-in-law, Margaret Patterson, she handled everything. Said Sarah couldn't bear to stay here anymore." She paused, studying his face. "But there's something you should know. Something Margaret made us all promise not to tell if this day ever came." The word hit him like a rogue wave. "Funeral. There was a service. Memorial, I guess, since they never found. Well, since you were missing. The whole town came out. Sarah was devastated, poor thing. She collapsed during the ceremony. Had to be carried out." The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's when Margaret said Sarah needed professional help. That's when the decision started getting made for her." David's knees threatened to buckle. They had held a funeral for him. Sarah had buried him, grieved him, said goodbye. And while she was doing that, he had been collecting rainwater in salvaged containers and catching fish with improvised nets, counting days until he could hold her again. Margaret put the house on the market the very next week, the woman continued, her voice gaining strength as if confession was lifting a weight. Said Sarah needed a fresh start somewhere without all the memories. The house sold fast. Young couple from Boston bought it as a summer place. But David, she hesitated. Margaret didn't just sell the house. She sold everything. Your boat, your truck, even Sarah's jewelry. Said it was all going toward Sarah's care. Where is Sarah now? The neighbor glanced around nervously, as if Margaret might materialize from the shadows. I don't know exactly. Margaret's been staying at the Anchor Inn since she got back from settling Sarah somewhere up north. Room 12, I think. But David, you need to know, Sarah signed papers before she left. Legal papers. Margaret showed them to anyone who asked questions. David shouldered his bag and walked away without another word, leaving the neighbor standing in her yard, staring after him like she had witnessed a resurrection that might damn them all. Behind him, the house that had held his dreams stood empty, its windows reflecting nothing but sky. The Anchor Inn sat 3 blocks from the harbor, a weathered 2-story building that had housed generations of fishermen and Coast Guard families. David's boots echoed on the wooden stairs as he climbed to the 2nd floor, each step heavier than the last. In his pocket, his dead cell phone felt like evidence of a life that had moved on without him. He knocked on the door of room 12. Who is it? The voice was sharp, familiar. Margaret Patterson, Sarah's mother, who had never quite approved of her daughter marrying a Coast Guard officer. Now David understood why. It's David. Silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Then the sound of papers being shuffled hastily, something heavy being moved, a chain being unlatched, a deadbolt turning. The door opened 6 inches, and Margaret's pale blue eyes peered out at him with an expression that wasn't surprise. It was resignation. Jesus Christ, she whispered. But she didn't sound shocked. She sounded caught. Hello, Margaret. She opened the door wider, revealing herself in a wrinkled blouse and slacks, her usually perfect silver hair disheveled. But what made David's blood freeze were the legal documents spread across her bed, not just property papers, but forms with official letterheads, and at the top of one, clearly visible, the words involuntary commitment. You sold my house, it wasn't a question. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, but her eyes never left his face. Sarah couldn't handle it. The mortgage payments were crushing her. Your life insurance hadn't paid out yet because there was no body. She was drowning in debt, her voice carried the practiced cadence of a rehearsed explanation. But that's not why you're really here, is it? You want to know about Sarah. Where is she? Margaret moved to the window, her back to him, but not before David noticed her hands were trembling. Safe. That's not an answer. David stepped closer to the bed, his eyes scanning the scattered papers. Among them, he saw Sarah's signature on multiple documents, but the dates made no sense. Some were signed after her supposed breakdown, in handwriting that looked forced, shaky. She's in a facility. A treatment center in New Hampshire. For trauma and grief counseling. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. The money from the house sale is paying for it. Show me the commitment papers. Margaret spun around, her face pale. What? Those papers on your bed. The ones you tried to hide when I knocked. Show me what you had Sarah sign. Margaret's confession hit harder than the North Atlantic waves that had nearly killed him. Sarah wasn't just grieving, she was institutionalized. But as Margaret reluctantly handed him the documents, David discovered something that made his blood freeze. Among the legal papers were divorce proceedings, dated 2 weeks ago, with Sarah's signature that looked nothing like her natural handwriting. She's my wife, David said, his voice deadly quiet. She was your wife. According to the state of Maine, you died 8 months ago. According to these papers, she's been legally incompetent to make her own decisions for 3 months. Margaret's mask was finally slipping. I did what was necessary to protect my daughter from a life of false hope and financial ruin. You had her declared incompetent so you could control her assets. I had her declared incompetent because she was having psychotic episodes, talking to your ghost, refusing to eat, refusing to leave the house. Margaret's voice rose defensively. She was going to die from grief, David. I saved her life. By stealing it. Margaret moved back to the window, her shoulders sagging. Do you have any idea what it was like for her? Waiting by the radio every night, hoping for news. Calling the Coast Guard twice a day for updates? She stopped eating. Stopped leaving the house. When they finally called off the search, she didn't just collapse. She started talking to empty rooms, setting places at the table for you, buying groceries for a dead man. David felt something cold and hard settling in his chest, but his eyes remained fixed on the papers. These divorce documents. When did she really sign them? Margaret's silence was answer enough. You forged her signature. I have power of attorney. I can sign for her. Not for a divorce, you can't. David's Coast Guard training kicked in, the same methodical thinking that had kept him alive on the island. What else did you sign for her, Margaret? What other decisions did you make while she was locked away? Margaret pulled a cigarette from a pack on the nightstand with shaking hands. Everything I did was legal. I have documentation. Documentation you created. David moved closer to the scattered papers, his trained eye cataloguing discrepancies. Different pens, inconsistent pressure, signatures that varied too much to be authentic. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been waiting for me to die so you could control Sarah's life? That's not. I never wanted you to die. But when I went missing, you saw an opportunity. David's voice was getting quieter, more controlled, the way it got before a storm hit. Tell me about the treatment center, Margaret. Tell me what you've told them about Sarah's condition. Margaret's hands shook as she lit her cigarette. Serenity Springs. It's a residential facility that specializes in trauma recovery. Sarah has been there for 3 months now. She's doing individual therapy, group therapy, art therapy. They say she's making progress. Progress toward what? Accepting that I'm dead? Accepting that her mother knows what's best for her. David picked up one of the commitment papers, studying the doctor's signature. Did you tell them she was talking to ghosts? Did you tell them she was incompetent to manage her own affairs? I told them the truth. Your version of it. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 8 months of deception filling the small room like smoke. David studied each document methodically, his mind cataloguing evidence the way he had once catalogued supplies on the island. I want to call the facility. The doctors don't think outside contact is wise. Not yet. She's in a very fragile state. She's my wife, David repeated, but this time his voice carried the authority of a man who had survived the impossible. According to these papers, she's not anymore. Margaret gestured to the forged divorce documents. According to the law, you're a dead man who has no legal standing to interfere in the care of a mentally incompetent woman. David stared at Margaret for a long moment, understanding finally settling over him like cold water. You're not going to tell her I'm alive. I'm going to tell her when she's ready to hear it without it destroying the progress she's made. When will that be? When I decide she's strong enough. David nodded slowly, setting the papers back on the bed with deliberate care. You know what kept me alive on that island, Margaret? It wasn't just hope of coming home. It was the absolute certainty that Sarah would be here waiting for me. The unshakable belief that our love was stronger than any storm. Margaret avoided his eyes. I was wrong about the storm, David continued. But I wasn't wrong about our love. And I'm not going to let you destroy what the ocean couldn't kill. What are you going to do? David shouldered his duffel bag one more time. I'm going to New Hampshire. I'm going to walk into that facility, and I'm going to tell my wife that I'm alive. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to her that some promises are worth keeping, even when everyone else has given up. The doctors won't let you see her. I've specifically instructed them. Margaret, David interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded rescue operations in hurricane conditions. I've spent 8 months fighting for my life. I'm not going to stop fighting now because you decided my wife is better off without me. The drive to New Hampshire took 4 hours. David spent the time rehearsing what he would say to Sarah, how he would explain not just his survival, but her mother's betrayal. The Serenity Springs facility sat on 50 acres of rolling hills, its Georgian colonial buildings designed to convey comfort and healing. Dr. Chen, the facility director, met David in the lobby with the wary expression of a man accustomed to difficult family dynamics. "Mr. Harrison, I must say your resurrection presents some unusual challenges. Your wife's treatment has been predicated on acceptance of your death. Reintroducing you suddenly could be traumatic. More traumatic than letting her believe I abandoned her? She doesn't believe you abandoned her. She believes you died heroically in service to your country. That's actually been central to her healing process, honoring your memory while learning to live without you." David studied the doctor's face. "What did Margaret tell you about Sarah's condition when she brought her here?" "That she was experiencing severe grief-induced psychosis. Hallucinations, conversations with the deceased, inability to distinguish reality from fantasy." Dr. Chen consulted his notes. "Your mother-in-law provided extensive documentation of erratic behavior. Did any of that documentation include medical records from licensed physicians?" Dr. Chen's pause was telling. "We relied primarily on family testimony and our own initial assessment." "I'd like to see that assessment." "I'm afraid patient confidentiality." "Dr. Chen, I've been declared legally dead for 8 months. I think confidentiality laws become murky when the patient's spouse returns from the grave." David's voice remained calm, but his eyes had the intensity of a man who had fought the ocean and won. "I'm not asking you to violate ethics. I'm asking you to consider that your patient's entire treatment might be based on false information." 20 minutes later, David sat in Dr. Chen's office reading Sarah's file. The woman described in Margaret's statements bore little resemblance to the Sarah he knew. According to the documentation, she had been found talking to empty rooms, preparing meals for a dead husband, unable to function in basic daily activities. But the clinical notes told a different story. Sarah's actual behavior at the facility had been remarkably stable. No hallucinations. No delusions. Just profound grief and what the staff notes described as appropriate emotional responses to traumatic loss. "Dr. Chen," David said slowly, "based on these clinical notes, would you say Sarah exhibits signs of psychosis or incompetence?" "I know. Her grief response has been entirely within normal parameters. We've been somewhat puzzled by the discrepancy between her mother's reports and our observations. Because she was never incompetent. She was grieving a husband she thought was dead, and her mother saw an opportunity to gain control of her finances and her life." Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair. "That's a very serious accusation. It's also true. And right now, my wife is in your facility receiving treatment for a condition she doesn't have, while the woman who put her here is spending her inheritance." The meeting with Sarah took place in the facility's garden, a quiet space surrounded by maple trees where patients often met with family members. David waited on a wooden bench, his heart hammering as he had never experienced in any storm. When Sarah appeared on the pathway, escorted by a counselor, David's first thought was that she looked smaller than he remembered. Her blonde hair was shorter, her green eyes holding a depth of sadness that hadn't been there before. But when she saw him sitting on the bench, when recognition finally registered, the sound she made was not quite a scream and not quite a prayer. "David!" She stood frozen 20 feet away, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at him as if he might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Hi, sweetheart!" Sarah collapsed to her knees on the garden path, and David was running to her before the counselor could react. They held each other on the ground among the fallen leaves, 8 months of separation and grief and stolen time collapsing into that single moment. "You're real," Sarah whispered against his chest. "You're real and you're here and I'm not crazy." "You were never crazy," David said, his voice breaking. "You were grieving. There's a difference." Mom said. "Mom said I was talking to ghosts. That I was preparing meals for dead people. That I couldn't take care of myself. Your mom said a lot of things that weren't true." They talked for 3 hours in that garden, carefully untangling 8 months of deception and medical manipulation. Sarah's memories of her supposed breakdown were hazy, fragmented by grief and the medications Margaret had convinced doctors to prescribe. "I remember being sad," Sarah said, holding David's hand as if it might disappear. "I remember missing you so much it felt like I was dying inside. But I don't remember being crazy. I don't remember talking to ghosts. Because you weren't doing those things. You were doing what any wife would do when her husband goes missing. You were hoping I'd come home. The house is gone. Along with everything else. But houses can be replaced." That evening, Dr. Chen called an emergency meeting with Sarah, David, and the facility's legal counsel. The evidence of Margaret's manipulation was overwhelming: forged signatures, exaggerated medical reports, financial documents that showed systematic asset liquidation. "Miss Patterson, I believe you've been the victim of financial and medical abuse," the legal counsel explained. "Your mother used your grief to have you declared incompetent, then systematically dismantled your life while you were receiving unnecessary treatment." Sarah stared at the documents spread across the conference table, her forged signature on dozens of papers, her mother's careful handwriting authorizing treatment Sarah had never requested, financial statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred from accounts Sarah didn't even know existed. "She planned this," Sarah said quietly. "Even before David went missing, she was planning this." David studied the dates on the power of attorney documents. Margaret had prepared them 3 months before his deployment, using language that would become active in the event of his death or disappearance. "She was waiting for me to die," David realized. "Or for something to happen that would give her control over you." The legal proceedings took 6 months. Margaret was charged with financial elder abuse, fraud, and filing false medical reports. The house on Maple Street had to be purchased back from the young Boston couple, who, remarkably, agreed to sell it back at cost after learning the story. But the real healing took much longer. Sarah and David spent those months learning to trust again, not just each other, but their own perceptions of reality. The trauma wasn't just David's survival or Sarah's grief, it was the violation of discovering that the person who should have protected Sarah had instead used her vulnerability as an opportunity for control. They attended counseling together, real counseling this time, with therapists who understood that love doesn't end with legal declarations of death, and that grief is not mental illness. On the first anniversary of David's rescue, they stood together in the garden at Serenity Springs, not as patient and visitor, but as survivors who had learned that some storms are created by nature, and others by the people who claim to love us. "I got a letter from Peterson yesterday," David said, referring to one of his fellow survivors from the island. "He's getting married in the fall. Wants us to come to the wedding. That would be nice. I'd like to meet the man who helped keep you alive." "I'd like you to meet the woman who kept me alive too," David said, squeezing her hand. "Who?" "You. Even when I thought I was going to die on that island, even when I had no food or water or hope, I could hear your voice telling me to keep fighting. That's what love is, Sarah. It's a voice that carries across impossible distances, telling you that someone is waiting for you to come home." 6 months later, David received a package with no return address. Inside, the original deed to 247 Maple Street and a handwritten note from the young couple who had sold it back to them. "We heard your story from the neighbors. We're glad the house is back where it belongs. Some love stories deserve a second chance." But the real gift came 3 weeks after that, when Sarah called David at work with news that made him understand why he had survived 8 months on a barren island, why he had fought impossible odds to return home. "David," she said, her voice carrying a joy he hadn't heard since before his deployment. "I'm pregnant." As David sat in his truck outside the Coast Guard station, staring at the ocean that had tried to kill him and the town that had buried him, he understood something Margaret had never grasped: love isn't about control or protection or making decisions for other people. Love is about trust. It's about believing that the people you care about are strong enough to survive their own storms, and wise enough to know when they need help. It's about being present for the healing, not just the hurt. Some storms, David realized, don't just take things away. Sometimes they teach an entire community what truly matters. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they bring you home to the one person who never stopped believing you were worth waiting for.